G'day legends, I hope that you are having a fantastic day, and I don't know what day you're going to be seeing this, but I have made this video in preparation for myself being in hospital due to chemotherapy and not being able to produce a video for the day. But today we are going to go over the US Annual Threat Assessment. Now, we did one of these about how it had the subparagraph Russia and what it sees as far as Russia's tactical and strategic threats. And I thought, well, let's go over then China's. And I think there are some large holes in this, although we need to know that it is, of course, bias. But you need to look at, just because a decision is made that affects you and may then increase their strategic ability, does not then mean that it was done due to that also. Okay, just because it's the byproduct doesn't mean that it was made for purely an aggressive stance. So this is written from a perspective, of course, so we need to take that into account. And I say this is what we are going over. The Annual Threat Assessment of the US Intelligence Community. Chief of the Director of National Intelligence, March 25. And this is the disclaimer, that this assessment, it provides insight into the situation while also influencing public perception. Remember, these also are in a form of propaganda and written from a bias also. So readers, they should approach it critically, recognising potential biases, strategic framing, and the broader geopolitical context. Now, I also worked with a contact behind the scenes and used an AI model to help with some gramming, some spelling, and some sources as well for extra context to then beef this up. Now, much of my time is going to go into then in the coming months and years to try to understand China as well. And the quote that you hear me say almost every day is that understanding an adversary requires seeing the world through their eyes without surrendering your own vision. So I'm going to be trying to become a lot more proficient and literate on China. But they, of course, see the world in a very different way to how the Western states and US hegemony do see it. And we need to go over a couple of books on this, and some books that I'm going to dive into again, as I haven't read them for a while. So we'll go over Henry Kissinger's On China and his Kissinger World Order. And the reason we're going to talk about these is just some quotes specifically about maybe how China see the world. Okay, the international order and China. That China's operated the longest lasting, most clearly defined, and one of the furthest from Westphalian ideas. China's also taken about the most complex journey from ancient civilization through classical empire to communist revolution to modern great power status, a course which will have a profound impact on mankind, and that China see their existence as eternal. They see that we've been around for 4,000 years, you a couple of hundred, that we will eventually come into power. A more holistic view, as per being more authoritarian, doesn't see in more 4-year bouts of power. Okay. China's position at the centre of the world order was so ingrained in its elite thinking that the Chinese language, there is no word for it. In this traditional concept, China considers itself, in a sense, the sole sovereign government of the world. Now, we also have one more we need to look at on China as well. Now, I'm going to be going through this book far more at depth, and we get a better idea when we look back at things, even, say, Sun Tzu, that ultimate excellence lies not in winning every battle, but defeating the enemy without ever fighting. The highest form of warfare is to attack the enemy's strategy itself. The next to attack alliances, the next to attack armies. The lowest form of war is to attack cities. Siege warfare is a last resort. Captures the city without laying siege, overthrows the enemy's state without protracted war. And you will see how China has a offensive approach through defence, and how I think that a lot of this then assessment and then people analysing this see it from an offensive rather than being offensive from a defensive strategic point of view. Okay? If you don't get it, we'll jump into it. Ideally, the commander would achieve a position of such dominance that he could avoid battle entirely, or else he would use arms to deliver a coup de grace on extensive analysis and logistical, diplomatic, and psychological preparation. So, the victorious army is victorious first and seeks battle later. The defeated army does battle first and seeks victory later. So very different ways of seeing the world, seeing strategy, and seeing then the roads to success. I give you that in the beginning because it does go over some of the largest holes, I believe, in this and the ability to see where China is actually sitting. So we're going to read over it and then we'll look at my breakdowns in this. China stands out as the actor most capable of threatening US interests globally, though it is also more cautious than Russia, Iran and North Korea about risking its economic and diplomatic image in the world being too aggressive and too disruptive. Growing cooperation among these actors expands the threat, increasing the risk that should hostilities with one occur, it may draw in others. Again, China wants to avoid hostilities. They want to be victorious through other ways, as we've seen historically, as I've shown you, and as you're going to see in this. Now, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, this is known in circles as the axis of upheaval. Okay. China has very quickly passed Russia as the biggest threat to US hegemony, and has very quickly passed the US and other states in industry, especially around navy and just hard assets. Now, it is important to keep in mind that China's careful approach isn't just about protecting its global image. It's actually a very smart strategy. They prefer competing economically and technologically rather than jumping straight into open conflict, as we have seen, as I just read. Also, when it comes to so-called cooperation between the axis of upheaval, the reality is a lot messier than it sounds. They sometimes do share goals, but these relationships are very transactional and temporary. It's more about mutual convenience than genuine unity. Historically, their alliances don't run very deep, so we shouldn't exaggerate how closely aligned these countries in the axis of upheaval actually are. Acknowledging China's strategic patience and their reliance on economic stability gives us a clearer picture beyond just military risks. It gives a picture wanting to defend and to get into a victorious position in defence and not risk that also. But we do see, I think, overstating how close these states are. It's a bit of an enemy is my friend, but there is no formal military alliance between China and anyone else. And I have stated time and time again, I think Putin needs to be very careful about that relationship with China and being used in that sense. So the strategic overview. President Xi Jinping of the People's Republic of China, or the PRC, want to achieve the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation by 2049. The PRC will seek to increase its power and influence to shape world events to create an environment favourable to China's interests, obtain greater US deterrence to China's interests, and fend off challenges to its reputation, legitimacy, capabilities at home and abroad. And this is, and you'll hear me multiple times in this video talk about this, the ability to long-term think, where there's so many cons to then authoritarianism, of course. But one of the pros to this, and I'm not saying I want to live in a state like that at all, is though you can have long-term thinking. You can think 50 years ahead. Or us in the West, depending on the country, you're thinking a maximum of 4 or 5 years and trying to get voted back in. So things move much more slowly. Beijing is deeply suspicious of US intentions and views Washington's measures against China as part of a concerted whole-of-government effort working with US allies and partners to contain China's development and rise, to undermine CCP rule and prevent China from achieving its aims. The People's Republic of China leaders are most concerned about a strong unified opposition from the United States and its allies, and are responding in part by strengthening ties with partners like Russia and North Korea. Of course, one of the big things we have seen due to the war in Ukraine is divisions then come about from then the war between NATO and its allies and Europe as well. At the same time, China's leaders will seek opportunities to reduce tension with Washington when they believe it benefits Beijing, to protect its core interest and buy time to strengthen its position. we need to go over. There's a lot in this. The idea of this great rejuvenation, this is not just a propaganda term. China genuinely views this as reclaiming their historical status as a major world power. It is deeply embedded in their long-term strategic thinking. China's suspicions of US intentions, this is not just paranoia or posturing as well. It's rooted in decades of strategic competition and specific actions by Washington and Western allies that Beijing perceives as threats or attempts to curb its rise. The proximity of military bases, sanctions and tariffs against China as well, this of course is developed that paranoia. That paranoia is not then there for nothing. Xi Jinping's strategy includes carefully timed periods of lowered tensions with Washington, likely not as an effort to reconcile, but as tactical moves designed to protect China's core interests and buy valuable time to strengthen their position. So these times where they reduce their tensions, this is to get China in their best possible position. China, they are looking inwards all the time. Maybe not inwards at individual, but inwards of what benefits Beijing, what benefits China the most here. And if it is lowering this or working with this here, they will do that, not just out of the goodwill of, okay, we'll do this. No, it's what pushes us forwards. This, again, it overestimates the relationships with then Russia and North Korea. And like I said, there's nothing formal here. It's more the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And we could definitely see more of a use of these countries as a proxy for China's global power and their pull over their economies too. China will likely continue posturing to be in a position of advantage in a potential conflict with the United States. China will continue trying to press Taiwan on unification and will continue conducting wide-ranging cyber operations against US targets for both espionage and strategic advantage. China will likely struggle to sufficiently constrain the activities of the People's Republic of Chinese companies and criminal elements that enable supply and trafficking of fentanyl, precursors and synthetic opioids to the US, absent greater law enforcement actions. China's military operations to project power over Taiwan and its efforts to assert sovereignty claims in the South and East China Seas occur routinely, and confrontations that increase concern of miscalculations potentially leading to conflict. China has demonstrated the ability to compromise US infrastructure through formidable cyber capabilities that it could employ during a conflict with the US. Beijing will continue to strengthen its conventional military capabilities and strategic forces, intensify competitions in space, and sustain its industrial and technology-intensive economic strategy to compete with US and economic power and global leadership. So again, we'll read through, then we'll go over this. China's aggressive posture around Taiwan in the South China Sea, it isn't necessarily preparation for imminent conflict. Again, there's still divide on analysts whether this will or will not happen. What it really is deterrence and strategic signaling intended as leverage. Again, that's why there is still arguments about this, or if China want to just weaken it to the point of where they can just then basically walk over it. We also need to recognise that China's emphasis on economic and technological competition often reflects rational self-interest rather than solely an intent to threaten US dominance. It's only aimed at the US because they're the dominant power in that way, not just because it is America. Now, what do I mean here? This goes back to what I said in the very beginning, that China wanting to bolster its artificial intelligence and move forward as a world leader in that. A lot of that is that competition that reflects national self-interest. Now, is that purely to try and threaten US dominance? Well, it could just be in a lot of self-interest and then making money. And then a subsequent action of that is threatening US hegemony. But we need to look at that good business doesn't then just mean that it's a strategic war as well, even if a byproduct means it then threatens you. I hope that makes sense. We're going to go over that then more. So as far as the fentanyl, Beijing, they may lack full control over then to be able to police this, but also it may lack a lot of incentive to crack down on these operations if it is working to their advantage. In short, framing every Chinese move as a preparation for conflict risks oversimplifying their actual strategy. Their actual strategy blends deterrence, economic ambition, geopolitical leverage, not necessarily their desire for war. And historically it has shown this as well. And their art of war is such. Military. China presents the most comprehensive and robust military threat to US national security, overtaking Russia at lightning speed. But there are still some holes and some problems. The PLA, the People's Liberation Army, is fielding a joint force that is capable of full-spectrum warfare to challenge intervention by the US in a regional contingency and project power globally, securing what Beijing claims as its sovereign territory. A major portion of China's military modernisation efforts is focused on developing counter-intervention capabilities tailored against all aspects of US and allied military operations in the Pacific. Beijing will focus on meeting key modernisation milestones by 2027 and 2035, aimed at making the PLA a world-class military by 2049. At the end of the day, they are, at the moment, a world-class military and the second most powerful, and in some sectors are the most powerful. Examples. The PLA advances in 2024 include the Navy's third carrier, beginning sea trials, and likely being ready to enter operational service by 25. The PLA rocket force probably is fielding the DF-27 ballistic missile with hypersonic glide vehicle payload option and an estimated range of between 5,000 and 8,000 kilometres. The ground forces are also fielding its most advanced multiple rocket launcher, this PCH-191, increasing its long-range precision strike capability. The PLA has improved its force structure readiness and training. The PLA probably has made particular progress in critical areas such as modernising key ground forces, expanding its navy with more modern combatants, and fielding a wide variety of new missile systems. It has also improved its electronic warfare capabilities. Now, there is a lot of elements that Russia has that China lack. Russia's electronic warfare is the thing behind the scenes, behind closed doors, that I hear the most concern about is, in the war in Ukraine, is Russia's ability to jam things from GPS and all-spectrum electronic warfare. That's the biggest concern. And this is something that China will want, and they will have money to throw at this. But the other key components is submarine warfare, and especially nuclear propulsion, that Russia are world leading in some of those aspects, anti-submarine warfare, experience on the ground, the ability to have propaganda that is effective to the West, and also one of the key ones I've forgotten this, and this doesn't go over, is how Russia, the largest exporter of a lot of food products, and China's not completely self-sufficient in that, and a protracted war could feed China. There's a very, very big holes in Russia and in China that fill each other and can become very powerful together. This is why I think so many of Trump's decisions that seem anti-Ukrainian and pro-Russian, if you look at it through the aspect of trying to draw Russia away from China due to those positions, become more clear. China's naval expansion isn't just about these carriers. They're making more ships than everyone else in the world combined, and they're rapidly growing their submarine fleet, likely with Russian assistance, especially for nuclear propulsion. And this does challenge the US naval superiority in the Pacific. Now, open source information at least, China's development of hypersonic missiles is ahead of the United States, giving Beijing a credible capability to bypass current US missile defences. Now, this fails to acknowledge two critical things. One, it doesn't acknowledge enough that part of China's aggressive build-up is driven by anxiety over US military presence near its own borders and its own critical interests. Have a look at where these bases and where these ships and carriers are. Which ones are closer to? Number two, China's sheer industrial output compared to the West. It greatly just goes over this. This became super obvious in the war in Ukraine with Russia and its allies. That North Korea outstripped the production, or at least the delivery of shells to Russia than the entire West did to Ukraine. And as I have heard recently on the Sean Ryan show, I believe, don't quote me on that, but you can quote me on this, that he has said, this guy said, as long as China can survive 6 days, we will be out of missiles. Later on in the video, we'll talk about how in attritional protracted war, survival, of course, benefits that with just the numbers to lose. Okay, let's continue on. The People's Liberation Army has the capability to conduct long-range precision strikes with conventional weapons against the homeland, so America's periphery in the Western Pacific, including Guam, Hawaii, and Alaska. China has developed a range of ballistic and cruise missiles with conventional payloads that can be delivered from its mainland as well as by air and sea, including delivered by nuclear submarines. China may be exploring development of conventionally armed intercontinental range missile systems, which, if developed and fielded, would allow China to threaten conventional strikes against targets in the continental United States. The PLA will continue to pursue the establishment of overseas military installations and access agreements to project power to protect China's interests abroad. Beijing may also pursue a mixture of military logistic models, including preferred access to commercial infrastructure abroad, exclusive People's Liberation Army logistics facilities with pre-positioned supplies to co-located with commercial infrastructure, and bases with stationed forces to meet its overseas military logistics needs. So in commercial areas, and we see this a lot in African Belt and Road initiatives, it's like, why is this airport built to then military then standards? So it could be used like that, and we're seeing a lot of this, especially to the north of Australia. Now, China is using complex whole-of-government campaigns featuring coercive military, economic and influence operations short of war to assert its positions and strength against others, reserving more destructive tools for full-scale conflict. Beijing will likely expand these campaigns to advance unification with Taiwan, project power in East Asia, and reverse perceived US hegemony, so US dominance. Beijing has pushed back against US military operations such as reconnaissance and bomber flights, freedom of navigation operations, exercises around PRC borders, and maritime claims. The PLA regularly intercepts and shadows US forces and sometimes conducts unsafe manoeuvres in their vicinity. Now, what this doesn't go into is, do you care to share in this how far away from home each of these are? Now, I'm not saying that they can't do this. You're in international areas and maritime claims, whatever. But Beijing genuinely sees that these US military operations, their recon flights, naval exercises right near their territory, they see this as provocative. Again, this is not a one-way street. Whether you agree or disagree with it, if you want to analyse where they're sitting, you have to see it through their vision, okay? So again, you see this, you see, oh, there's been, a PLA intercepted by an F-35. And you go, yeah, but where exactly was it? And if they were flying right down the border of Mexico, would we be doing the exact same? So let's break down this whole sector in here. The second part, of course, of their, was it military? Yes, of their military overview. Now, this is very focused on their capabilities without talking about the rationale behind developing these. It makes China sound purely aggressive rather than strategically defensive, which, of course, I've shown you historically the way they would want to fight. China is developing long-range conventional missiles capable of hitting the US. This sounds alarming, but it's also worth remembering that these systems are likely more about deterrence and leverage than an actual intention to strike. Protracted attritional war with China, for China, means massive economic impact, and they don't want that. They want that over 50 years to just end up as the state that is dominant through then being strategically defensive. China's pursuit of overseas bases isn't that different from what other global powers do. Of course, the US. They've done this historically, and also their overseas bases are about national interest also. That goes against maybe ours, but it's still, if you look at it through their lens, it's about protecting their trade routes and economic interests. It's not just aggression. It's how you perceive some of this. And just because something is seen as strategically aggressive doesn't mean that was the goal in the beginning. Remember, anything that increases China's global dominance is seen as strategically aggressive to the country that is the strategic dominant country. China's military expansion is clearly a challenge, but treating all their actions as purely hostile risks misunderstanding their actual strategic thinking. Recognising their perspective doesn't justify their moves, but it helps clarify the bigger strategic picture. Like we said, some of this doesn't give the rationale behind these systems. The missile program, such as the DF-27, it's not just about advanced technology in multiple launch rocket systems. This is specifically designed to threaten US bases in Guam. Of course, deterrence. Now, number 7. Sorry, did I do this one? I should be deleting these, but if I want to go back, I want to have it there. Taiwan and maritime flashpoints. In 25, Beijing will likely apply stronger coercive pressure against Taiwan and perceived increase in US support to the island to further its goal of eventual unification. The PRC calls for a peaceful unification with Taiwan to resolve the civil war that drove Taiwan's separation, even as it threatens to use force to compel unification if necessary. So use of force if necessary, but again, we see this is not their number one goal, and counter what it sees as a US attempt to use Taiwan to undermine China's rise. I think from their perspective, seeing that they're using Taiwan to undermine China's rise, I think is completely fair enough to see it that way. I'm not saying I agree with China seeing it, but I can definitely see if you were Xi Jinping in Beijing saying, why are you doing this on an area which we claim way away, okay? A conflict between China and Taiwan would disrupt US access to trade and semiconductor technology critical to the global economy, although some of this is getting slowly moved across to the US mainland. Even without US involvement in such conflict, there would likely be significant and costly consequences to the US and global economic and security interests. Beijing is working to isolate Taipei by pressuring states to downgrade diplomatic ties and support China's reunification goal. Since 2016, Taiwan's official diplomatic relationship have dropped from 22 to only 12, and several of the remaining ones are vulnerable to Chinese pressure. China is advancing military capabilities for a cross-strait campaign while also using its armed forces to exert a steady state pressure on Taiwan. The PLA probably is making steady but uneven progress on capabilities it would use in an attempt to seize Taiwan and deter, if necessary, to defeat US military intervention, and is intensifying the scope, size and pace of operations around Taiwan. Beijing will continue to pressure Taipei with economic coercion and probably will increase it if it sees Taiwan taking steps towards formal independence. It could suspend preferential tariff terms, selectively ban Taiwan imports to China, and arbitrarily enforce regulations. And this comes from another expert, not the one that helped me with some of these slides. But I think, to China, they'll try and economically weaken Taiwan first, use grey zone tactics to blockade the island as it needs to import much of its supplies, and try to create animosity or insurrection from within, which they could use as pretext to intervene for regional stability or something else. I don't see them going in without foreplay. Beijing's aggressive efforts to assert sovereignty claims in the South and East China Seas are heightening tensions that could trigger a broader conflict. In 24, PRC tactics in the South China Sea led to the loss of the Philippines' unilateral access to some disputed areas and forced talks between Beijing and Manila, in which the Philippines agreed to concessions in exchange for access. However, Manila is unlikely to relinquish its claims, creating potential for escalation by either side. Tension between China and Japan over the Senkaku Islands last flared up a decade ago. Since then, China's ships have remained in proximity to the disputed islands, occasionally entering the territorial zone and driving responses from Japan's self-defense forces to monitor the activity. Again, this misses China's preferred methods. Beijing's threats toward Taiwan, these are serious. But the threats are also about signalling and deterrence. Strategically defensive is the key word here. China, they genuinely prefer peaceful reunification, primarily because the conflict would severely damage their economy and global reputation, of which they are very dependent on. Look at Russia in Ukraine. They don't want that. This understates how devastating this would be for China itself, given their reliance on external states for trade and technology. This describes China's pressure tactics on Taiwan's diplomatic ties without mentioning that China views these as defensive actions against what it sees as US encouragement of Taiwanese independence. So it sees the US using Taiwan to be against China. Let's continue. Cyber. The PRC remains the most active and persistent cyber threat to the US government, private sector and critical infrastructure networks. The PRC's campaign to pre-position access on critical infrastructure for attacks during crisis or conflict, tracked publicly as Volt Typhoon, and its more recently identified compromise of US telecommunications infrastructure, also referred to as Salt Typhoon, demonstrates the growing breadth and depth of the PRC's capabilities to compromise US infrastructure. So it's pre-positioned, much like the Israeli Mossad with then the pages. You pre-position this and go off. Now, of course, that's just an example, but similar to this. Now, if Beijing believed that a major conflict with Washington was imminent, it could consider aggressive cyber operations against US critical infrastructure and military assets. Such strikes would be designed to deter US military action by impeding US decision-making, inducing societal panic, and interfering with the deployment of US forces. We have also seen a lot of what I would refer to as probing cyber attacks from China in Australia, and I'm guessing in the US too. Now, I would be very interested to know how much information sharing there is between Russia and China in cyber to do with conventional warfare. All major powers, they now use cyber espionage. This is not just exclusive to China, although they are, as they rightfully point out, the greatest threat. What we went through in the next part of then this assessment was Russia's cyber, that they're the only ones with experience in conventional warfare, mixing conventional tactics with cyber tactics too. I'd love to know really what is the relationship between China and Beijing and Moscow. And I would think it would be crazy if I was a Chinese general or I was Xi Jinping to not have your senior members in Moscow somewhere overlooking some of this for experience, which you do lack. Exactly like what we are gaining conventional experience from Ukraine, that China won't gain that from Russia. Again, I think this shapes China as the front foot aggressor, which doesn't stand up historically or really unbiased. Beijing, they clearly use cyber as a strategic tool. Due to their strategy, China, they are unlikely to launch destructive cyber attacks against US critical infrastructure unless it genuinely expects an imminent military conflict. Remember, they are much more careful than say Russia, as we saw in the opening slide. So they're not going to do it unless it is like legitimately imminent, because such attacks, these could quickly escalate beyond then anyone's control and harm China itself economically massively. It would have huge impact. Let's talk about economics. PRC seeks to compete with the United States as the leading economic power in the world. To do so, the strategy calls for a centralised, state-directed and nationally resourced approach to dominating global markets and strategic supply chains, limiting foreign competitors and making other nations dependent on China. PRC leaders are applying the same strategies to bolster China's position and become more globally dominant in supply chains. Both upstream inputs it can provide more cheaply than others, and in downstream production at wider scale. Again, just because it has a strategic effect on you doesn't mean that that is their primary goal. It can just be trying to then push their own interests also. China's weak domestic demand, coupled with its industrial policies, such as manufacturing subsidies, have enabled a surge in cheap Chinese exports in sectors such as steel, harming US competitors and fueling a record PRC trade surplus. Now again, this is framed as purely aggressive, but again, this is somewhat of business. Yes, it can have strategic impact and is, but it's not just that also. China's dominance in key supply chains enables its use of economic coercion against countries that adopt policies Beijing opposes. Beijing is developing an institutionalized framework enabling more assertive and centrally controlled trade retaliation. PRC leaders are using ostensibly unofficial or technical trade and investment barriers, administrative regulations, logistics, and symbolic sanctions in a targeted way against individuals, firms, and sectors, in parallel with messages to warn and deter. Again, captures coercion rather than aggression. PRC leaders appear to be preparing for more economic friction with the US and probably are weighing options with the new US administration while looking for leverage and other ways to prevent major escalation and decoupling in areas that, of course, push China's interests. China's economic model, it's state-directed and it is very aggressive economically. But like any economy, it is driven by legitimate ambitions to maintain growth, stability, and independence. It's just very aggressive in those then people see as purely hostile rather than just, at least outwardly, very capitalist aggressive, which isn't then internally domestic too, if that makes sense. It's worth noting that using economic leverage to influence politics is definitely not unique to China. Look at the UN, look at the US, look at the West currently using economic leverage to influence politics. Look at even internally what's being done to, say, Hungary. It's really worth noting how reliant on things like Australian iron ore that China is. 60 to 70% of it is then Australian. So this, again, is why this strategic deterrence coercion is more likely than an all-out war, because China's so reliant on bits like this. And back to the slide we talked about, they will lift and move around sanctions when it benefits themselves. But also misses how sanctions on Russia can provide resources at a discount. So, of course, the sanctions on Russia's looking for other markets. They export a huge amount and China can pick that up to then further go for their cheap Chinese exports and ability to stay not only competitive but world leading in many aspects of their economy. China's dominance in the mining and processing of several critical materials is a particular threat, providing it with the ability to restrict quantities and affect global prices. Beijing has shown willingness to restrict global access to its mineral resources, sometimes in response to geopolitical disputes, as with its banning of exports to the US of metal used in semiconductor manufacturing, such as gallium, germanium, and antimony in December 24 in response to US export controls on advanced semiconductors and chip-making equipment. See, tick for tack is occurring. Other examples include when the PRC temporarily stopped rare earth element exports to Japan in 2010 and Beijing's creation of new laws codifying its authority to restrict mineral exports. A prolonged cessation in supplies controlled by China could disrupt critical inputs needed for the US industry and technological advancements. Now, you've heard me for a year bang on about Houthi rebels targeting the Red Sea and ice breakers. China has similar aims in global shipping and resource access, including in the Arctic, where melting ice is creating opportunities for expanding maritime transport and energy exploitation, especially in the North Sea route, the NSR off Russia's coast. You and I have looked into this for a long time. China seeks access to the Arctic's to the Arctic's vast natural resources, including oil, gas, and minerals. A lot of these, due to melting ice, are becoming more and more available over the next century, or reachable. Even though China is not among the 8 Arctic countries that control territory over the region, Beijing seeks to normalise more direct and efficient maritime shipping routes to Russia and other Northern Hemisphere areas as a way to fuel its economic growth and energy security and reduce its dependence on Middle East energy. China has gradually increased engagement with Greenland, mainly through mining projects, infrastructure development, and scientific research projects. Why do you think Trump is looking at Greenland? Despite less active engagement right now, China's long-term goal is to expand access to Greenland's natural resources, as well as to use the same access to key strategic foothold for advancing China's broader and economic aims in the Arctic. They are a near Arctic power. Russia is an Arctic power, and China has a lot of money to throw at Russia when Russia's economy is struggling. Now, let's talk about that dependence on then minerals. US dependence on China for critical minerals is a strategic issue, and Beijing has used this leverage before. China's control of critical minerals is indeed a legitimate strategic concern and something that the US must address. Of course, they must address medications and antibiotics as well, they are reliant on. China's use of resource leverage, while this is concerning, it is also predictable as a response to increased US economic pressure rather than purely unprovoked hostility. China's resource leverage is not just completely unprovoked hostile actions. It's tick for tack that is then occurring. But we will see more of this, and I think we'll see the pendulum swing much more serious as we go. China's moves in the Arctic. These are clearly strategic and broadly consistent with the activities of other non-Arctic nations that also seek to influence or economic advantage in the Arctic. Working with Russia, there is the threat as well that this can expand greatly into Russia's nuclear icebreaker fleet, which they are the only ones who make those. Again, this is not just purely aggressive geopolitical dominance. China also has genuine economic needs like energy security and shipping efficiency through the North Sea, and of course for then the resources that sit in there. So it's not purely just aggression also. There's also genuine needs that of course can be perceived as aggressive if you're the competing state. And if whatever country was the competing state, if Australia was the competing state, it would be seen as very aggressive also. But working with Russia here on the development of nuclear icebreakers, this is why I said when that ship went down carrying nuclear icebreaker parts, I said there's no way this just sunk on its own. And working with Russia, who is the only nuclear icebreaker operator, there's a lot of concern there about the access to areas in the Arctic and reliance on those breakers due to emission regulations and power to break through the ice year round. So keep an eye on that, and we will keep an eye like a hawk on that. That is a lot bigger than we believe. Technology. China is using an aggressive whole-of-government approach combined with state direction of the private sector to become science and technology superpower, surpass the US, promote self-reliance, and achieve further economic, political, and military gain. Beijing has prioritised technology sectors such as advanced power and energy, AI, biotechnology, quantum information science, and semiconductors, further challenging US efforts to protect critical technologies by tailoring restrictions narrowly to address national security concerns. China is accelerating its science technology progress through a range of licit and illicit means, so legal and illegal means, to include investments, intellectual property acquisition, theft, cyber operations, talent recruitment, international collaborations, and sanctions evasion. Some forecasts indicate China's technology sectors will account for as much as 23% of its GDP by 2026, more than doubling since 2018. You can see how this rise has gone so quickly, but it is starting to then burn out a little bit. In addition to private funding, the PRC government is investing hundreds of billions of dollars in priority technologies such as artificial intelligence, microelectronics, and biotechnologies in pursuit of its self-reliance goals. China has almost certainly has multifaceted national-level strategy designed to displace the US as the most influential AI power by 2030. China is experiencing a boom in generative AI with the rapid emergence of a large number of developed models, and is broadly pursuing AI for smart cities, mass surveillance, healthcare, science technology innovations, intelligent weapons. Chinese AI firms are already world leaders in voice and image recognition, video analytics, and mass surveillance technologies. The PLA probably plans to use large language models to generate information, deception attacks, create false news, imitate personas, and enable attack networks. China has also announced initiatives to bolster international support for its vision of AI governance. China has stolen hundreds of gigabytes of intellectual property from companies in Asia, Europe, and North America in an effort to leapfrog over technological hurdles, with as much as 80% of US economic espionage cases in 2021 involving Chinese entities. Now, we need to look at this again as far as genuine interest and strategy. China is definitely pursuing technological leadership with intensity, combining state control and massive investment. Their success in artificial intelligence, particularly in their surveillance, voice recognition and generative models, is genuinely world-class. But this also makes sense, and can you blame them? AI is the future for dominance for global hegemony, so of course they're going to put a lot of effort into that. Although it may be able to be used in a hostile way, I believe this is not the primary aim. The aim is in line with China's dominance through strategic defensive posturing, that this then helps. So these are not mutually exclusive. Of course they run in line, but there is genuine interest in this as well. Stolen intellectual property and cyber espionage is very, very real. China has saved billions, tens or hundreds of billions, and has leapfrogged competition due to doing this. Espionage is a serious concern, but we can't just put all of their AI, then legitimate AI dominance on that it's stolen. We also need to take into account they have their own legitimate research and development in S&T that is progressing very quickly. Just saying that it's stolen property, this is oversimplifying the issue. We need to still recognise that it is still world-class domestically as well. Remember how DeepSeek very recently scared the shit out of everyone, especially people who have put money in those AI companies in the US. Next slide. China, they also see biotechnology as critical to becoming a dominant economic power and intends to grow its domestic bioeconomy by 3.3 trillion this year. Beijing is investing heavily in collecting health and genetic data, both at home and abroad, in pursuit of these goals. We'll talk about the ethics after this as well between China and the West and where this can play into advances in things. And it has shown it can be globally competitive in certain low-cost, high-volume commodities, such as biomanufacturing and genetic sequencing. Beijing has identified genetic data as a national strategic resource and is expanding state control over the country's gene banks and other genetic repositories, positioning it to potentially lead in precision medicine and agricultural biotechnology applications. Can you fix my tumour? China has made progress in producing advanced 7-nanometer semiconductor chips for cryptocurrency mining and cellular devices using previously acquired deep ultraviolet lithography equipment. So just look at Huawei, for instance, but will face challenges achieving high-quality, high-volume production of these chips without access to extreme ultraviolet lithography tools. Chinese researchers also continue to explore applying advanced patterning techniques to the DUV machines to produce semiconductor chips as small as 3 nanometers. China leads the world in legacy logic semiconductor 28 nanometer chips and up in production, accounting for almost 40% of global capacity, and is expected to add more capacity than the rest of the world combined through 2028. Again, do you really think China's stripping chips out of washing machines or buying them off then the world's biggest exporter? These legacy chips are vital to producing automobiles, consumer electronics, home appliances, factory, automation, broadband, and many military and medical systems. Remember, speaking of military, they have larger chips because they are more reliable. They don't need the amount, like a missile has far less computing power than your phone. It doesn't need to access Facebook and Instagram and OnlyFans. It does one thing. It goes here to there. So you can use larger, more reliable chips. Now, to break this down, China's biotechnology investments primarily through then a strategic lens. This is how it is seeing it. But it misses the fact that biotechnology development is also about economic growth and health advancement, especially due to China having an aging population. This is not just purely geopolitical advantage or aggression. Not everything China does is just the boogeyman, even if it does threaten our hegemony. China's aggressive push into semiconductors partly stems from US export restrictions, which intensified China's pursuit of semiconductor independence. But this is how sanctions backfire. We're seeing this in Russia right now, that you apply restrictions, of course, they'll find other ways around it. And then we see China, if they're restricted, they'll then pursue this. Just as Russia is restricted one way, that they'll pursue another way. And over long term, they will find these markets in a developing third world or global south as a whole. Weapons of mass destruction. Of course, China, they want 1,000 deliverable warheads by 2030, and a relationship with Russia can definitely help this. One thing this doesn't go over is China has a lot of nuclear entanglement. So what this means is, imagine you have a base that has conventional warheads as well as nuclear warheads at it, and what we refer to as hot swappable items. So you have a booster with a nuclear warhead and a conventional warhead, and it's hot swappable, you can change it. The problem is this nuclear entanglement means striking this facility is striking a nuclear facility, even if it may fire a conventional warhead. This sort of gives a bit of a gives a massive deterrence to striking conventional facilities. China remains intent on modernising, diversifying and expanding its nuclear posture. China's nuclear weapons and advanced delivery systems pose a direct threat to the homeland and are capable of delivering catastrophic damage to the US and threatening US military forces at home and abroad. China most likely possesses capabilities relevant to chemical and biological warfare, CBW, that pose a threat to US allied and partner forces as well as civilian populations. And I'll say, no shit, I think we all have a lot of that stuff. Now, let's then continue on biosecurity. I thought I chopped it off. Biosecurity. China's approach and role in global, biological, medical and other health-related global priorities present unique challenges to the US and the world. The pandemic, I don't know if I can say that word on this website anymore, that ultimately led to the death of more than 1 million Americans and multiples more worldwide, began in China. And Beijing still refuses to acknowledge this as where it started and that it was then a leak, at least according to the US. China's strict censorship and repression of free speech prevented doctors treating the earliest of patients in Wuhan and warning the world so far as serious contagion that Beijing wanted told, slowing the world's preparedness and response. To this day, Beijing refuses to fully cooperate with the rest of the international community, trying to definitively pinpoint the precise cause of the disease so it can head off and prepare for any new disease. Regarding its origins, then intelligence agencies have continued to evaluate new information from classified and open sources to revisit previous reporting and consult with diverse technical experts to increase our understanding of the cause of the pandemic. These efforts have led the CIA to assess that a research-related hypothesis is more likely than natural origin hypothesis, so research-related lab leak. Other hypotheses for this of natural origin includes many scenarios in which humans could have been infected with SARS-2 and the virus that causes this as a close progenitor of exposure to wild and domestic animals. China is home to a diverse body of naturally occurring coronaviruses, found in a wide geographic area. And therein precedents for these viruses emerge within human populations from reservoir locations. For example, the coronavirus that is the closest relative to the SARS, the virus that causes severe acute respiratory syndrome, probably originated in the Yunnan province, according to scientific studies, even though the first SARS outbreak detected in humans in 2003 occurred in the Guangdong province, hundreds of miles away. The research-related incident hypothesis also considers a broad range of potential initial human infection scenarios, from events in research facilities such as government, university laboratories to research-related activities in the field, such as collecting samples from wild animals. So, again, China's censorship, their strict censorship and suppression of crucial information, it slowed the global response massively. The lab leak in the beginning was seen as a conspiracy. Since then, this hypothesis gained credibility and has become the main then hypothesis, as we even see in this, but it's also important to recognise that definitive proof, it still remains elusive due to the reasons above, that there is a case where it can be naturally occurring also. So, pharmaceuticals. We spoke a little bit on this. China's dominance in pharmaceutical and medical supply production, combined with lower quality, safety and environmental standards than those of the US, which are already pretty low, positions Beijing to potentially restrict such exports for leverage over Washington and others in trade and security disputes. The PRC plays an increasingly important role in supplying pharmaceuticals and related medical supplies to the US, as well as the rest of the world. The US imports of Chinese pharmaceuticals Medicines, vaccines, blood, organic cultures, bandages, organs grew almost fivefold between 2020 and 2022 alone, from 2.1 billion to 10.3 billion. The PRC also might look at uniquely provide such supplies and medical aid to countries more cheaply and at scales competitors cannot reach, as a way to boost its global influence at the expense of the US. The PRC's vaccine diplomacy during the pandemic, it provided vaccines to 83 countries and was driven, at least in part, by geopolitical considerations such as currying favour for the new port in Burma. Now, all of this is a combination of China's strategic ambition, genuine economic and logistical strength. This does absolutely need to be looked at in the US in case of protracted war. Good business, of course, comes with a strategic threat, but it doesn't mean that that strategic threat is its only goal. China is still allowed to have good business. Now, space. We're getting there, boys. We're at almost an hour. China has eclipsed Russia as a space leader and is poised to compete with the US as the world leader in space by deploying increasingly capable, interconnected, multi-sensor systems and working towards ambitious science and strategic goals. China has achieved global leverage in some of its intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance constellations and world-class status in all but a few space technologies. China's Beidou constellation is a world-class position, navigation and timing capability that compares to GPS, Europe's Galileo or Russia's GLONASS. Their ISR architecture and satellite communications are areas the PLA continue to improve upon the close perceived gap between itself and the US military. Now, I don't see this militarily as a huge thing. I'll talk on that in a bit. China's successful lunar sample return mission in June contributes to Beijing's technological prowess and national prestige while supporting its effort to land astronauts on the moon by 2030 and establish the first lunar base by 2035. China's commercial space sector is growing quickly, with aspiration to be a major global competitor to US and European space companies. For example, China launched the first set of satellites into low Earth orbit proliferation constellation last year for its own satellite internet service to compete with, of course, things like Starlink. Counter-space operations will be integral to military campaigns. China has counter-space weapons capabilities intended to target US and allied satellites. China has already fielded its ground-based counter-space capabilities, including electronic warfare systems, direct energy weapons, and anti-satellite or ASAT missiles intended to disrupt, damage, and destroy target satellites. Now, this link in with this up here. China has also conducted orbital technology demonstrations which, while not counter-space weapons tests, prove its ability to operate further space counter-space weapons. China has also conducted on-orbit satellite inspections of other satellites, which probably would be representative of the tactics required for some counter-space attacks. Russia is also focusing a lot on these DEWs and ASAT as well. We went over that a couple of days ago. In the link below, you can find my one of these on Russia. Now, this is a big concern that we need to take into account both commercially and strategically. Remember, things like Starlink, that is, of course, very strategic too. That is not civilian commercial use only. That is incredibly dual use. The reason I say that I don't think this thing up here with their constellation, GPS and GLONASS is such a big deal in hot war is in time of hot war, all of these assets, Russian, Chinese, US, European, will be taken out within minutes. Even if one side doesn't get their weapons off, Kessler syndrome will take care of the rest. I believe that is what it's called. So if you hit, say US hits Chinese, then satellites in orbit, because those break up and fragment everywhere and little bits of steel are flying around at 20 kilometers a bloody second, it's going to rip everything else apart. So everything will be taken out. This is why it's imperative that forces learn how to fight dark without these map and compass, and I'd like to know what efforts China is doing to then, quote, fight dark. All right, we're near the end. We get into the conclusions in a bit and bits that are missed. Malign influence activities. Beijing will continue to expand its coercive and subversive malign influence activities to weaken the US internally and globally, as well as counter what Beijing sees a US-led campaign to tarnish China's global relations and overthrow the CCP. Through these efforts, the PRC seeks to suppress critical views and critiques China within the US and worldwide, and so doubts the US leadership and strength. Beijing is likely to feel emboldened to use malign influence more regularly in coming years, particularly in fields such as AI, to improve its capabilities and avoid detection. PRC actors have increased their capabilities to conduct covert influence operations and disseminate disinformation. For example, pro-China online actors in 2024 used AI-generated news anchors and fake social media accounts with AI-generated profile pictures to sow divisions on issues such as drug use, immigration, and abortion. Now, it is accurate to emphasise China's expanding use of AI-driven disinformation campaigns, such as the actors and profiles that we see. What we need to question is how much success are these having? How much coercion and influence are these really having? But also that this is not going away and it's going to get better and better. Now, China has gone to huge efforts to suppress criticism and shape global narratives. We also see, if you ask DeepSeek certain questions, especially at home. All major powers, they do this for their own world order, as far as trying to put themselves in the best possible position and suppress certain narratives, and especially outside of their own country. This is exactly how soft imperialism and with the rules-based order democracy works. So what we see is, far as moving your way around, so this soft imperialism and rules-based order, I'll talk about this in relation to, say, Hungary and the EU, is I call it sort of a soft imperialism or woke imperialism, is for the rules-based order that Western and Central Europe see, then restricting on certain things in Hungary or Romania or Slovakia to then push their own rules-based order or their practice of democracy. And China, they're doing very similar when they see it encroaching on their world order. Remember, they have their own world order of where they see, and they're just as confident as that, and we are in then ours as being right. This is where this idea of being right is might falls apart, because Macron believes he is just as right as some bloke sitting in a cave for an extremist group, just as much. Xi Jinping believes that he is right also. Now, the West will always deflect issues around drugs and immigration onto foreign partners. Typically, it's Putin. I like the meme of someone on a bike. It'll say like, this economy, stick in the spokes and bloody Putin. We move a lot of these issues onto that, and now a lot onto Xi Jinping. But in reality, I believe this has 1% actual influence. I think the main influence, the 99%, is our shit, incompetent leadership and our policy that then they create. That is really what is to blame. If people in Europe are upset about immigration, what is having more of an effect? Chinese and Russian intelligence campaigns, or real effect being felt at home due to incompetent leaders and policy? Okay? I think we shift a lot of the blame onto that because it's easier than going, hey, dickhead back there may have fucked up some policy, okay? Or not looking at real facts that then have huge impact. Like in Australia, for instance, we had a leader the other day say that the reason our energy price is high is because of Russia, which is fucking ridiculous. One of the biggest coal exporters in the world with coal power plants. Shut up. You're just moving accountability on from yourself. Now, China's challenges. There are some missed in this. China faces daunting challenges that will impair CCP leaders' strategic and political achievements. China's leaders probably are most concerned about corruption, demographic imbalances, and fiscal and economic struggles because they threaten the country's economic performance and quality of life, two key factors underpinning the CCP legitimacy. Despite an acute economic slowdown, China's leaders probably will resist making needed structural reforms and instead maintain statist economic policies to steer capital towards priority sectors, reduce dependence on foreign technologies, and enable military modernisation. China's growth probably will continue to slow because of low consumer and investor confidence. China's birth and marriage rates continue to decline, reinforcing negative population trends and a shrinking labour force. This is a real problem for China. It's a real problem everywhere. Xi's, the president, focus on security and stability of the CCP and securing other leaders' personal loyalty to him is underpinning China's ability to solve complex domestic problems and will impede Beijing's global leverage. Xi's blending of domestic and foreign security threats is undermining China's position and standing abroad. reducing Beijing's ability to shape global perceptions and compete with US leadership. Now, all major powers are facing huge population issues, and the population decline, this is a massive overseen issue. To do with the population, I see that Russia and China, they are forming a lot of relationships with countries in the global south which have an increasing population. While Western alliances, NATO countries say, they are then, say, all in together with no one then increasing in population, and then what they're doing is they're relying on immigration to solve that population decline. Now, immigration in decades, this can change the voting base of a country, and this, of course, then can change alliances, then your trade, your outlook, of course, in a democratic vote. And this is one of the problems with this, and we don't know how this looks long term. One, we see then Europe's turn against immigration already, okay? But let's look at it from the way of, say, Australia. Australia's bringing a lot of then Indian immigrants into Australia. Now, over decades and decades of time, will we see the voter base change to be more friendly towards India or that world order? So this can have a huge then effect. We see Russia and China tying themselves to those economies, but still remaining more independent, where we are bringing that then in. We'll see how this goes over the next decades. You and I, well, I definitely won't be here to see it. Now, they touch on vertical leadership style, centralized leadership. Now, this is aimed at personal loyalty and security, and this can absolutely limit China's effectiveness in addressing these complex issues. The Soviet Union had similar issues that you really get away with a lot of like creativity because you don't have that amount of, say, flexibility. Although China views state-led models as having successfully delivered stability and growth historically, making them reluctant to reform this. This idea of, well, you're a few hundred years old and we are 4,000. Now, this vertical centralized leadership in time of warfare, this can speed up and reinforce internal cohesion. This is why martial law exists. This is why martial law, say, in Ukraine, has been put into place, is to have a more than vertical leadership, and therefore you can make these decisions far more quickly. That is why that exists. So, conclusion in this, we've gone over a lot. China. That this is, of course, highly complex, and we need to look at, again, China's complexity, their history, and as well that this is a US assessment. So, needs to display how actions pose a threat to the US, even if the action in itself may not be malign, that it is then may be hostile towards America, that America's interpretation of it is hostile because it's then threatening their hegemony. It may not be in its beginnings threatening like that, if that then makes sense. So we need to remember that this is a US assessment. That Pepsi Max, like zero sugar Pepsi, was made because Coke Zero was selling well. It's not a strategic war against Coke. It is to remain competitive. I do think, much like with Russia, we add our own standards onto their, quote, worldview and see every move as strategic warfare while failing to understand different views of world order. Again, this understanding of adversary requires seeing the world through their eyes without surrendering your own vision. Now, this assessment largely frames China's actions as purely aggressive, overlooking the reality that many of Beijing's strategies, such as military modernization, technological self-reliance, and influence operations, are primarily defensive, aimed at deterring perceived threats, particularly from the US. Failing to recognise this defensive logic risks misunderstanding China's true motivations, leading to flawed strategic responses and unnecessary escalation. I think there's a real gross misunderstanding there. Now, what is good in this breakdown is my conclusion. Highlights genuine strategic vulnerabilities, such as dependence on Chinese pharmaceuticals, critical minerals. This accurately captures China's broad use of cyber espionage, economic coercion, AI-driven influence operations. These are all a major concern. Effectively emphasises internal challenges that China faces, including demographic decline, economic slowdown, and leadership rigidity under Xi Jinping. This provides solid examples such as semiconductor export bans, vaccine diplomacy, and maritime pressures that effectively illustrate China's coercive leverage. Remember, strategic deterrence leverage in this. Accurately captures China's Arctic ambitions, although we could go over that a lot more. Now, what is lacking and what gaps have I seen in this? Now, balanced context, although we were never going to get this because it is a US assessment. If it was a China's assessment of the US, it would also have a degree of bias, so it's never going to be completely balanced. But this overly frames China's actions as purely aggressive or hostile, neglecting the strategic logic or defensive motivations behind many of Beijing's decisions. Comparative perspective. It often ignores similar tactics used by major powers, including the US, making China's actions seem uniquely malign. Nuance on partnerships. Exaggerates unity among China, Russia, North Korea and Iran, overlooking the transactional and limited nature of their relationship. The recognition of legitimate innovation. It too narrowly attributes China's technological gains and espionage and theft, downplaying genuine domestic innovation efforts. And you can see where the danger is in doing that. It downplays Russia's ability to fill key gaps in military capability and the opportunity that sanctions have now awarded China to gain some of that then Russian resource and whatever else. Russia's push towards China and its resources. Sorry, I'm bloody not reading my own slide. It has a the flat-out rejection of Western ideals by many billions around the world. So many billions around the world reject Western ideals, that they don't share the same then worldview. And many of these people do not see China as an imperialist, aggressive state like the West may see. Remember, the West is the exception, not the rule. We're still a very small percentage of the world. And the breaking up of it could make then our already small percentage be fractured into then subgroups. It doesn't touch on the pure numerical advantage from men to industry, that quantity is a quality of its own. Just how many people China has and just their sheer industrial capacity to just pump out shells. What has been the biggest thing lacking for Ukraine from the Western support? Just numerical delivery of stuff, not then those technological advanced systems that can be jammed. And imagine if the satellites were dropping out of the sky. Mao famously remarked in 1957, "I'm not afraid of nuclear war. There are 2.7 billion people in the world. It doesn't matter if some are killed. China has a population of 600 million. Even if half of them are killed, there are still 300 million left, remaining being a global power." This goes into the numerical advantage of men. It also misses how our own ethics may put us behind, especially in artificial intelligence and, say, genetics, and also the appetite for losses and hardship, that I believe the Chinese population will have more of an appetite for large losses due to propaganda, due to just state-run everything as well, may accept more of that, say like the Russian society, I believe, also in the same way, and also live in much more hardship, at least on a whole, so may put up with more challenges like this. Like if there's not bread in the supermarket, people panic, okay? So there's that. But also I speak on this ethics around, say, genetics and AI. So we have massive restrictions on how AI can be used, and also on genetic sequencing, changing things around. There's so many restrictions on that. Now, I'm not saying we fucking lift that, but I am saying that it may put us well behind in some of those factors as well. So I think that's a lot of what is overlooked in this. Legends, if you have made it to this point in the video, I owe you a beer at the minimum. Legends, you have a fantastic day, and I'll speak to you. Actually, I'm on chemo at the moment. Foreshadowing. I don't know when I'll see you, but thank you for watching to this point if you've made it. Cheers. Bye-bye.